My name is Alex Lovelace, and I will be moderating today's panel. Each of our distinguished panelists will speak for about 20 minutes, which should leave plenty of time at the end for some questions. We will start with Dr. Andrew Preston, who taught for 20 years at the University of Cambridge, and who is currently a distinguished professor of diplomatic history at the University of Virginia. He has published 11 books, including, most recently, Total Defense, The New Deal, and The Invention of the National Security State. Today, he will be speaking to us about the American empire from World War II till present. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Preston. Yeah.
Great, thanks for that introduction, and thanks for inviting me to be here. I want to thank Alec and Shalin for all the work you guys have put into this conference, and for inviting me here. I've heard of this conference many times over the years. It's been one of those venues that I've always thought I'd love to present here. It'd be so much fun, and now I'm here, and I'm batting leadoff as well. So there's a lot of pressure. I'm not going to talk so much about the American empire. I've sort of shifted my thinking a little bit, although it's going to be implicit in what I'm going to be saying, and I'm happy to answer any questions or start a discussion on that. And the reason that empire is inherent in what I'm going to be speaking about is because I want to talk about the decline of the liberal international order today, something that is constantly commented on in the media. But I'm a historian, and so what I wanted to do is to begin at the beginning and to look at an essential part of the founding of the liberal international order in the World War II era, but an essential part, an indispensable part of that founding of liberal internationalism that I think is taken for granted. It's not exactly ignored, but it's taken for granted, and that is national security and the emergence of the national security state. Liberal internationalism worked in the 1940s, but not before, even though there were many attempts to implement a liberal international order or some sort of liberal international vision, most famously Wilsonianism just after World War I. But nothing really stuck until the 1940s, because until then, none of these systems were portrayed as necessary, as an essential part of the defense of the nation. And this is where national security comes in. National security was a different conception of self-defense, not the traditional protection of territorial sovereignty, and that's what made it work. But of course, that has also caused some problems over the ensuing decades. So how did this extremely expansive basis of threat perception happen? And is it changing once again today in the era of Donald Trump? Well, most people, including most historians, at least in my field of diplomatic history, assume that national security as a way of defining threat perception, as a way of perceiving the external world, is timeless. And historians talk about George Washington's national security policies, or Thomas Jefferson's, or James Madison's, and so on and so forth. But I argue that it is to think of national security in that way, as timeless, is anachronistic, because national security itself has a history. And it was invented in a specific period in the late 1930s and early 1940s, and invented as much for reasons of domestic politics, which I think is why I'm on this panel of Power at Home, domestic American politics as geopolitics. So what did FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president who invented national security, who created national security, what did he mean by national security? Well, before the late 1930s, early 1940s, American self-defense, national defense, meant the protection against physical threats to territorial sovereignty. So it literally meant protecting the safety of the nation. And when FDR invented national security, he went way beyond that and created something much more capacious than the defense of territorial sovereignty. That is, by the way, the physical defense of territorial sovereignty against a physical attack is still today in international law how the legitimate use of force is defined. You can only use force in the name of self-defense if you are actually preventing an attack on your territorial sovereignty. And of course, American self-defense means something much, much, much more than that, and it has ever since the late 1930s and early 1940s. So what did FDR mean by national security? And I'm using FDR here as a shorthand for President Roosevelt for sure, but a lot of people around him who were sort of doing the work for him in creating and legitimating a vision of national security. So what did he mean by national security? He meant protecting against remote and distant threats anywhere in the world, and threats to an American way of life, because they could one day become physical military threats, even if they were far away now, and even if they weren't military at the time. And so he reconceived the basis of U.S. self-defense by making it ideological as well as territorial, normative as well as physical, global, and not just continental or even hemispheric. And he argued that it was necessary, that this new way of perceiving threats in an increasingly interdependent, or as we would say today, globalizing world, it was necessary because without this new formula of expansive threat perception, the nation would be in danger. As I said, there were previous attempts to implement a liberal international order, most notably under Woodrow Wilson, but all of these previous attempts lacked that secret ingredient that FDR added to the mix of necessity because of self-defense. That if we don't recognize that threats are no longer simply physical threats against California or New York or Florida, protecting against an invasion along American coastlines, that the United States would be in an even greater danger, and the whole idea of the United States, the whole democratic experiment, the whole American way of life would cease to exist. And that's what FDR added to this mix. If you look at previous foreign wars before World War II, World War I, the Spanish-American War, if you go any foreign war or foreign conflict after the Civil War, presidents and secretaries of state and others who were in favor of war did not use self-defense as a justification. Not even Woodrow Wilson does this in 1917. And if you read his war address and all the other speeches he gives in March, April, May, and afterwards of 1917, he does not portray Germany or any other state as a direct threat against the United States. He talks about making the world safe for democracy. He talks about protecting freedom of the seas, which of course is to some extent connected to American actual continental defense, but in a more abstract way. He never told Americans that they were in danger and therefore they had to make the world safe for democracy because it would make them safe. He never made that extra step, and we often think that he did, but if you look at what he actually said, he did not. And that's the difference that FDR did. He took almost everything else in Wilsonianism, made it American grand strategy, but added that secret ingredient of self-defense that he was calling national security to the mix. And I argue this is why it worked. So why did FDR need to invent a new doctrine of self-defense in the late 1930s, early 1940s? And here's where domestic politics comes in. So starting in around 1936, 1937, Roosevelt very much wanted the United States to play a much greater role in the world crisis and in resisting Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Maybe at first not through outright military action, but eventually FDR foresaw that possibility. But he certainly wanted the United States to become much more involved. FDR's problem is that the United States itself was not going to be attacked by either Germany or Japan. It just wasn't feasible that the continental United States, or the contiguous United States, I should say, because there was a threat to Alaska and some of the Aleutian Islands were occupied during the war. But the contiguous United States, the nation state of the United States on the North American continent was not going to be attacked. No matter how hard he tried, and he did try really hard to portray the US at risk of some sort of air attack or ground assault from Germany and Japan, and lots of other people did too, it just wasn't realistic. Now, this gave FDR a huge domestic political problem because this was the era of isolationism. And I put isolationism in quotation marks because most isolationists weren't actually isolationists. They were deeply internationalist Americans who happened to be anti-war. They just didn't think, they thought that World War I was a huge mistake, and that getting involved in another European war, let alone a European and an Asian war, would bring even greater misery to the US. World War I was blamed for all sorts of things by the 1930s, including to some extent the Great Depression. And so Americans, a majority of Americans, absolutely did not want to repeat what they saw as that mistake. And there were some isolationists, and there were people who were hemispherists or continentalists, people like Charles Lindbergh, who were very popular at the time and made a very powerful argument when internationalists like FDR would say, we need to expand our sense of self-defense and we need to rebuild our military in order to guard against a potential German air attack. Lindbergh, who was the foremost expert on aviation and air power at the time, would say air power in our situation, where we are geographically, favors the defender, no question. There's no way that Germany or Japan are going to be able to start bombing American cities. We'll be able to intercept them long before that. And Lindbergh would say things like, look, if the Germans can't cross the English Channel, they can bomb English cities, but if they can't cross the English Channel to mount an invasion, then how on earth are they going to cross the Atlantic Ocean? Lindbergh could be portrayed as a Nazi sympathizer. And so he was a domestic political threat to Roosevelt and the internationalists and the interventionists. But he wasn't that big a threat because he could be portrayed as a Nazi sympathizer. They could portray him like that because he was a Nazi sympathizer. I mean, that's pretty clear. And he held all sorts of other objectionable views. It was more like people like former President Herbert Hoover, whom FDR defeated in the 1932 election, who posed a much bigger problem. Because there's no way that you could portray someone like Hoover as an anti-Semite or as a xenophobe or a nationalist or a nativist. Somebody who just wanted to sort of, pull up the drawbridge and separate the United States from the rest of the world. Hoover was probably the most internationally minded and internationally experienced American of his generation. And there are all sorts of Herbert Hoovers in the 1930s, people who can't be just dismissed as isolationists and put to one side. And so as FDR was making a case through 37, 38, 39, 40 for the US to take a greater role in the world crisis and portraying Germany especially, but also Japan, as these huge threats to the American way of life, people like Herbert Hoover would then take to national radio and give speeches to large audiences and publish in the nation's major newspapers saying, look, the Germans are terrible people, the Nazis are terrible people, and the German government is doing awful things, but they're never going to attack us. We should rearm and we should protect our borders, but if we do that, then we're going to be the toughest nut to crack in world history, and we will be safe. And that gave FDR an enormous problem because logic, as I said, was on Hoover's side. And so what this forced FDR to do, he didn't give up his goal of getting the US more involved. Instead, he exaggerated American vulnerability and he expanded the notions of American threat perception. He expanded them geographically to say anything that happens anywhere in the world can now, in this new world order, this new world system, can come to harm us. So we have to sort of nip it in the bud instead of waiting for it to become an overwhelming threat that is about to attack our borders. So he expands the idea of self-defense geographically, but he also does ideologically. He told Americans, as he warned in the summer of 1940, we cannot remain a lone island of democracy in a world ruled by force. And that makes sense to us today, but at the time in 1940, that was a thoroughly revolutionary concept, because he was saying basically that separation does not mean safety. Up till that point, all through the 19th century and the early 20th century, Americans thought that their separation, their geographic separation from the rest of the world, would bring safety. And as long as they kept apart, they would remain secure. That's what the whole idea of the Monroe Doctrine is. And FDR turned that on its head. And he said that may have made sense in the 19th century. It makes no sense today. And therefore, we need to get involved. And as he was doing this, as he was making this case, a case that the political scientist at the time, Harold Lasswell, said was a ground-laying exercise in domestic political propaganda, FDR turned to this phrase, national security, again and again and again. Now, until that time, that phrase, national security, was almost never used in American political discourse, certainly not to refer to military or diplomatic or geopolitical threats. Before 1936, 1937, when FDR starts to refer to American self-defense or threat perception as matters of national security meant something totally different. It meant socioeconomic security at home. So when Americans talked about national security in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they were talking about things like pensions or unemployment insurance or bank solvency or financial regulation to make sure that stock markets weren't swindling people and ripping people off and that sort of thing. And that's what FDR meant in his first term whenever he said national security. So 1933, 1935, in the first and second New Deals, FDR does talk about national security, but he's always referring to the Depression. It has nothing to do with foreign threats at all. And then by 1937, when the Depression isn't over by any means, but it's certainly under control or it's tamed, and the sense of crisis that capitalism and democracy itself might cease to exist because of the economic crisis, that sense of crisis has waned. But at that very moment, the world crisis is escalating, and FDR then turns to this idea of national security, and he takes it from domestic socioeconomic policy problems to foreign and military problems. And he comes back to this phrase, national security, again and again and again, and uses that phrase, national security, more times than all other presidents before him combined. So FDR uses that phrase, national security, more than all presidents from George Washington right up to Herbert Hoover combined. And most of the uses of that phrase are in the 1937 to 1941 period. In other words, in the period when he's getting in this big domestic political argument with the anti-interventionists, the anti-war people, and yes, the people who were actual isolationists. And so there are two parts of this argument here that I'm making. One is that FDR invents the idea of national security for geopolitical reasons, but he also does for domestic political reasons. And he turns to a concept that is grounded in a new social contract that the New Deal is founded on. This idea that the government has an obligation to its citizens to protect them from remote and distant threats. And for the New Deal, that was old age and unemployment, among other things. And for national security, that means protecting against remote and distant threats like Germany and Japan. And so I think we need to see national security as the flip side of the same coin as social security. That they're both about the government saying, look, we have your back to the American people. Even if you're not unemployed right now, like even if you're at work, even if you're not old, we will protect you. And we're gonna set up this safety net in order to make sure that you're protected in an increasingly complicated, interdependent modern world. And then he says essentially the same thing about foreign policy. Germany and Japan might not be able to be storming the beaches of Florida or California, but we are going to now put in place a lot of measures that are going to protect you in this increasingly dangerous world. And so the argument that New Dealers made in the 1930s, that laissez-faire economics led to the Depression, an unregulated economy just went wild and then created the Depression, and therefore you needed the New Deal to step in and fix it. That same argument is made with regards to isolationism. That if the US doesn't join the League of Nations, takes a step back, lets the world system run wild, that's going to lead to the dictators and world war. And the solution then is for the government to step in and build what we now call the national security state. The national security state expands, of course, once FDR makes the vision, the attack on Pearl Harbor legitimates it domestically. It convinces Americans that they have an interest in this national security state for the US government to protect them in this increasingly dangerous world. And then it's sort of cemented in the early Cold War, where the Soviets then replaced the Nazis as the ultimate threat, not only to American geographic security, but also to its ideological security. And that basic matrix of national security, of threat perception, that takes hold in the 1940s stays the same through the Cold War and into the post-Cold War period, even if the actual national security threats themselves change, from communism to terrorism or whatever, and even where the hotspots change from Europe to East and Southeast Asia to the Middle East. That vision of national security even survives disasters like the Vietnam War and the Iraq War, where Americans agree that what constitutes a threat to their safety is not just that the continental United States is going to come under attack, but that an American way of life, it could be democracy, it could be capitalism, it could be all sorts of other things, is under threat. And that notion, that national security notion, is at the heart of liberal internationalism. Liberal internationalism isn't just about sort of, showing respect for allies and upholding the rules-based international order. At its heart, the glue that keeps all that together is a sense of threat, is a sense of danger, and that is what FDR first started calling national security, and every president since has called national security. Now I'm out of time, and I almost deliberately timed this, timed my paper in this way, so I wouldn't have to say a whole lot about the Trump administration. But I would just say that whole notion of national security and what it means, that basic matrix of threat perception that has remained mostly unchanged since the 1940s, is now coming apart at the seams, but in a way that there are times when I think, oh yes, this is going to happen, and then of course, events move this way. I mean, things are happening so fast and in contradictory ways. In one sense, the Trump administration is sort of reinforcing the traditional notions of national security, like when he imposes tariffs. And I can talk more about that later on. But in another sense, the whole point of the America First movement, a lot of the sort of MAGA foreign policy vision that J.D. Vance expresses more clearly, I think, than President Trump himself, is about sort of shedding those remote and distant, the sort of commitments to fighting remote and distant threats, and just to sort of come home America and protect the United States. Where that's going, I'm not so sure, because as I said, on a day-to-day basis, it's moving all over the place. But I do think we'll be looking at this period for 50, 100 years from now, for all sorts of, to look at these transformational changes to a lot of things, but especially to American national security. Thank you. Oh yeah, sorry.
Appreciate it. All righty, our next speaker is Carl Balzer, who earned his doctorate from Ohio University's History Department in 2022, and who is currently a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. His prolific publications focus on nuclear strategy and national security policy. His current book project is on former Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger. This morning, he will be speaking to us on American nuclear deterrence in the 21st century. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Balzer.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lovelace, for that much too kind of introduction. And thank you, Professor Holcomb, Dr. Van Tine, and the Contemporary History Institute for having me back here. As some of you know, I spent several years here as a graduate student, where I think graduate students are fortunate to have great professors, build great friendships, and really the best that I know of the historical study of geopolitics, strategy, American political life, comes from Ohio University. So it's great to be back. And in the time that I have, I'd like to discuss the state of American nuclear deterrence, what our nuclear force posture looks like today, why it looks the way it does today, and where I think it should move in the months and years ahead. And really, I think any assessment of our nuclear force posture has to begin by the roles it fulfills in American foreign and defense policy, and also that force posture's relation to our adversaries' force posture. So I'll start there and kind of build my way up into my suggested prescriptions for what we need to change. And so at a fundamental level, our nuclear deterrence really fulfills three main roles, the first of which is a deterrence, obviously, of our adversaries. And that deterrence covers the entire spectrum of risk, from peacetime competition to open conflict. So our nuclear forces, they deter conflict at any level of intensity, whether that's a local conventional probe, a large-scale conventional conflict, a limited nuclear attack, or a large-scale nuclear exchange. But even if that conventional deterrence should fail at the front end of a conflict, our nuclear forces still extend deterrence into wartime. That is, our nuclear forces kind of hang this nuclear shadow over the battlefield to convince our adversaries not to try to escalate their way to victory or escalate their way out of a failing conventional war by employing nuclear forces of their own. And so, but if that nuclear deterrence should fail, our nuclear forces can still respond, if a president should decide to do so, in a selective and limited fashion with nuclear weapons in an attempt to either terminate a conflict altogether or to at least bringing the fighting back down to the conventional level of warfare. And I think it's important for me to note here that our nuclear targeting doctrine, nuclear force doctrine, reserves the right to employ nuclear weapons first in a conflict. That doesn't mean that we're going to necessarily wait for the adversary to employ them first, because if our adversary believes that they can launch a conventional war without drawing an American nuclear response, that could convince Vladimir Putin, for instance, to think that the Baltics are safe for conventional war, or Xi Jinping could think that move on Taiwan is safe for conventional war. And that would make war less likely, or more likely, not less likely. And the same goes for non-nuclear weapons of mass destruction attacks. Think biological or chemical weapons. If we say we will only employ nuclear weapons in response to an adversary nuclear attack, that could convince our adversaries that they could freely use chemical or biological weapons without drawing a nuclear response from us. And these points kind of dovetail with the second role of our nuclear force posture, which is the assurance of our allies. It's really our nuclear forces, especially those that are forward deployed in Europe, that reassures our allies that we have their back, that if the balloon goes up, we will come to their defense first with our conventional forces. So if we change our policy to one of no first use, that would really rattle our allies. That might convince them that they need to go their own way, they need to get their hands on their own nuclear trigger, and this could lead to the spread of nuclear weapons around the world. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is very important. I don't want to say it's not useful, but really the biggest inhibitor, the biggest preventer of nuclear spread has been our forward diplomatic posture, conventional military posture, and nuclear force posture around the world, which has really been what has halted the spread of nuclear weapons. And we don't bear this nuclear burden as a charity to allies in Europe or Asia, because a world more crowded, I think, with nuclear weapon states is one in which there's a world with more nuclear triggers. And so, say, for instance, if Putin moves on the Baltics or Poland, Poland gets jittery and decides to escalate with nuclear weapons at a time when we don't want to escalate. We could be entrapped in a nuclear war we don't want to be in. And so if there's more nuclear triggers in the world, that makes escalation management that much more difficult. Of course, we don't know if a nuclear war can be managed or controlled. I would be very skeptical of anyone who tells you we can conduct a protracted limited nuclear war. The whole point of these things is so we don't have to use them. And so the third role really for our nuclear forces is to hedge against uncertainty. And so there's really two kinds of uncertainty that we hedge against. One is adverse developments in the geopolitical environment and the threat environment that are unanticipated. And so think if there's this kind of Asian continental power that decides to jettison their very small nuclear deterrent and decides to embark on a large-scale nuclear buildup that we didn't anticipate. And say that nuclear force planners decide that we need more nuclear capability to offset that buildup in Asia so we can still simultaneously deter Russia and Europe. What we do is we have what's called a ready reserve stockpile, which is these nuclear warheads we have in storage. They're not deployed, and we can rapidly take them out of storage, upload them on our strategic nuclear triad to offset that buildup in Asia. And then the second thing we hedge against is technical failures in our nuclear force. So we keep a strategic nuclear triad, airborne leg, sea-based leg, land leg. So if there's a failure, a fleet-wide failure in our Trident D5 submarine-launched ballistic missile, we still have the airborne leg and land-based leg that we can quickly upload warheads from our reserve stockpile, excuse me, onto the airborne and land-based leg. And so, to my mind at least, our ability to fulfill those three roles, deterrence, assurance, and hedging, I think is constrained today somewhat, but in the future, it's going to grow even more constrained. And this is because our force program right now was essentially set in stone during the Obama administration in the early 2010s. And that was structured around a series of planning assumptions that just didn't pan out. For instance, and this was on a bipartisan basis, both Republican and Democratic presidencies. You only have to look at Russia, for instance. George W. Bush famously looked into Putin's eyes, saw into his soul. He says that he saw something, I don't know what, that he could trust. And then so in May 2001, he gives a talk at National Defense University, says the Cold War is over, our nuclear force posture should reflect this new reality. And so we decide alongside Russia to cut our forces something by about 2/3, so 1,700 to 2,200 strategic nuclear warheads. At that time, we decide that at this time we're dealing with essentially the Reagan-era buildup nuclear weapons and delivery systems. They need to be modernized because they're aging out. We decide not to modernize them. And you have to remember that the global war on terrorism is happening now, so we have wars we need to fight and win. But these assumptions essentially held sway still in the Obama years. The Prague speech in 2009, when Obama says Russia's not that great of a threat, we can take measures to some point in the distant future, move to a world that's free of nuclear weapons. And so we signed another strategic arms control treaty with Russia, and within the limits of that treaty, we structure our force posture in such a way as to not be provocative towards Russia. So that means on our 400 Minuteman land-based missiles, which can carry 3 warheads, we decide to upload them with just 1 warhead. And so that's not provocative towards Russia because it takes 2 warheads to take out a missile silo. Those missile silos are hardened and buried. Taking out a hardened and buried target is a function of the number of attacking warheads and their accuracy. So we tend to devote 2 warheads to each Russian missile silo. And then we also decide in the early 2010s to replace our 14 Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines with 12 next-generation Columbia-class ballistic missile submarines, which will come online slowly in the 2030s. But those 12 Columbia-class submarines only have 16. They only house 16 ballistic missile submarines. So we're taking about a 40% cut in our sea leg. The Obama administration also decides to retire our Tomahawk land attack nuclear armed missiles, which we housed on our attack submarines, which were really our only enduring forward presence in East Asia. So we retired those in 2013. And these assumptions were with Russia, but we also kind of felt the same way with China. China always maintained a very small nuclear arsenal, 200 warheads, very primitive compared to ours, not survivable to a first strike. We could disarm them if we so chose to. And our nuclear planners believed that China would remain a lesser included case. And I say lesser included because their thinking was whatever is sufficient to deter Russia is more than sufficient to simultaneously deter China. And the same thing played with North Korea and Iran. We thought that diplomatic and economic sanctions could roll back their nuclear weapons program, and that we could work cooperatively with Russia and China to ensure that they don't get nuclear weapons. But none of these planning assumptions obviously panned out. We heard last night in the keynote address all the bad things that Putin's up to, and we read in the papers every day about what China's up to, which is really a short-of-war coercion campaign against not just Taiwan, but Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Australia, all along that first island chain. And they're willing to ramp up this pressure because this long-running short-of-war coercion campaign is now operating under the cover of a darkening Chinese nuclear shadow. And I say darkening because since 2020, they've more than tripled their nuclear warheads. They've gone from 200 to over 600. The Pentagon has assessed that by the mid-2030s, they will achieve nuclear parity with us, which means they will deploy the same 1,500 weapons that we do. And for the first time in China's nuclear history, they've developed a modern, really sophisticated, survivable strategic nuclear triad. So they have a medium-range bomber that can deliver air-launched ballistic missiles against Guam, Alaska, Hawaii. They have now, for the first time, an extended-range submarine-launched ballistic missile, which can reach out and strike large swaths of the continental United States from protected bastions in Chinese home waters like the South China Sea. And China has also recently laid down 3 new missile silos spread out and geographically dispersed silos in its northwestern desert. And again, like I mentioned with Russia's silos, because these are hardened and concrete and deeply buried, not deeply buried, but buried, they're very hard to get at. You need to devote 2 warheads to them. And so that's really, those silos is really what's putting upward pressure on our nuclear force posture, because if China were to have focused their buildup on the submarine launched, their sea leg, that really wouldn't complicate our nuclear targeting, because if you can find, fix, and track a Chinese ballistic missile submarine, that means you can kill it with a conventional munition. And if you can kill it with a conventional munition, that means you will have killed 16 of those missiles that those submarines house. And so, as I've mentioned, the targeting of silos is much different, and that's what really puts upward pressure on our strategic missile force. So I mentioned our ready reserve stockpile earlier. We need to upload from that onto both our land-based Minutemen and our Trident D5s that are at sea. And we need to do that because those are the 2 systems that can promptly hold at risk China's silos, that can, at least in theory, threaten those silos before they're launched. And so if they target those silos before they're launched, then we can limit damage to the continental United States. And that damage limitation capability is important because our allies like Poland or Japan will be wondering if we would really come to their defense if we lie entirely exposed to a strategic attack on the American homeland. And so, let's see, in the last 5 minutes I have here, I'll wrap up with kind of a quick sweep through our theater nuclear force posture. I mentioned that if we're entirely exposed to a strategic nuclear attack on the American homeland, then that can raise concerns among our allies that they will have decoupled our strategic nuclear forces from their defense. And so that's why we forward deploy nuclear gravity bombs in Europe right now, because that's what truly anchors our nuclear umbrella to them. It ties us to them. And so in Europe, right now we're dependent on 200 gravity bombs that are carried on dual-capable aircraft. And those dual-capable aircraft are vulnerable both on the ground and if they're flushed in time, they're vulnerable to Russian air bases. So we only have 200 gravity bombs there. Russia has some 2,500 non-strategic weapons. And these include intermediate range weapons that they deployed because they violated an arms control agreement with us that they had signed. Russia's violated every arms control agreement they've essentially agreed to with us. And the situation is very similar in East Asia. I mentioned that the Obama administration retired our only enduring nuclear system with an enduring presence in East Asia, the Tomahawk land attack missile. And so China is now taking advantage of that and built up medium-range systems that can cover all the targets it needs to across the first and second island chains. So there's a deterrence gap we have in Asia and in Europe that we need to fill at the theater level. I'd like to stay on time here, though, and close this out before I run up against my time. I'd be happy to go into specific prescriptions in the Q&A about how we can fill that theater gap. But I've spent a lot of time here today talking about kind of military capability, and deterrence is definitely about military capability, but it's also about political will and our diplomatic posture. And right now, kind of trends in our diplomatic posture, I think it goes without saying, aren't that great. We're threatening to invade Greenland. Not good. And so now in Poland, there's conversations about getting their own nuclear trigger. Germany, of all places, has really had a strong nuclear taboo throughout its post-World War II history. There's kind of a little talk there of getting their own nuclear trigger. And obviously South Korea is a big one as well, Japan. This Iran war has pulled missile interceptors away from East Asia, and that makes the South Koreans nervous. We've pulled away a Marine amphibious unit from East Asia, which makes Japan very nervous. And then if you throw in our diplomatic posture with Japan, the Pentagon has been begging the Japanese Prime Minister to be more clear about whether or not Japan will intervene in a cross-strait Chinese invasion of Taiwan. She complied. She said that scenario very well could draw a Japanese response. So China does what China does, and they immediately started running fighter aircraft across the strait at China in response to this declaration. And so what do? We do nothing. We provide no diplomatic backing for Japan and its prime minister. So we need to get the military capability right, but if we don't get our diplomatic posture right, the state of our nuclear deterrence will, I think, deteriorate in the months and years ahead. So I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions you may have in the Q&A.
Okay, well, next up is Dr. Robert Ingram, who is the Director of Programs on the Humanities and the Western Tradition in the Civitas Institute at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the former Associate Director of the Hamilton School for Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida. Before that, Professor Ingram taught history for almost 2 decades at Ohio University. This morning, Professor Ingram will be discussing contemporary attempts to reform American higher education. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Ingram.
Thanks much for that, Alex. Thank to Holcomb and Shallon for making this work. And I gave Holcomb all the opportunities to not ask me to speak, and he did, so it's his fault. So Alec Holcomb, ever the optimist, has asked me to speak about an uncontroversial topic, higher education reform. It's a subject about which many in the academy have views that run the gamut from ardent opposition to implacable hostility. And even those, invariably administrators, who recognize the need for reform in higher education mostly do so out of grim necessity rather than out of heartfelt conviction. Reform is necessary because it's been imposed on American colleges and universities by the federal government and by state governments. And it certainly didn't emerge organically from within higher education. The very fact of reform's imposition has caused much consternation, but so too has the source of the imposition and the content of what's being imposed. Faculty and administrators never like being told what to do by outsiders, but they really don't like what they're now being told to do or by whom they're being told to do it. So my old friend Holcomb has invited me back to OU to speak about, perhaps even to defend, something which most in our profession hate. Thanks, Alec. So far as I can tell, Alec lighted on me for this task because in the time since leaving OU 4 years ago, I've been involved in a couple signal ventures associated with higher education reform. One's at the University of Florida, where I serve as Associate Director and then Interim Director of the Hamilton School for Classical and Civic Education. The second's at the University of Texas at Austin, where I've just moved to build its new program on humanities in the Western tradition, and to serve on the university's committee charged with recommending a new core curriculum. These are important reform efforts at the flagship universities in the nation's second and third biggest states and ones in the rapidly expanding Sun Belt. They're not the only game in town, but work in them gives me a different perspective than most on higher education reform and how it's viewed not just from inside universities, but from the outside. So in the time I have this morning, I want to just answer three basic questions. One, what is higher education reform? Secondly, why are those advocating it? Do they think it's necessary? And third, briefly, what's being done about it in Texas and Florida. So most broadly speaking, the efforts by federal and state governments to fix problems they perceive in America's colleges and universities constitute higher education reform. These efforts are based on the conviction that something's broken in higher education. It's also grounded on the conviction that universities will not reform themselves and that outside intervention is therefore necessary. Some reforms are proscriptive. Most controversially, from the perspective of the academy, reform has involved ways that institutions of higher education treat people based on race, sex, and identity. Broadly speaking, reforms of this sort have prioritized colorblindness and deprioritized identity in hiring, admissions, programming, and curriculum. Proponents of reform argue here that they're simply upholding long-standing civil rights law. There's also a demand that students and faculty need to be free to say the things what they think while at universities. This includes, for instance, job applicants' freedom not to have to write mandatory DEI statements as a condition of employment. These particular demands are made in the name of free expression. Other reforms are constructive, and particularly there have been efforts to build new things in higher education. In some cases, states, mostly red states, have been involved in establishing new centers or schools which expand the aperture of what's taught, particularly in the humanities and the social sciences. That in turn has involved hiring new faculty and developing new curricula for these centers and schools. So why have these reforms been imposed on higher education? Well, I think one place to start is public confidence. Public confidence in higher education is falling. In 2025, Pew Research found that 70% of Americans think higher education is going in the wrong direction. In 2018, 60% thought that. Today, only 28% of Americans think higher education is headed in the right direction, down from 40% 8 years ago. Even more worryingly for universities, both parties have turned negative on universities. 5 years ago, half of Democrats or lean Democrats thought universities were headed in the wrong direction. Now 65% do. Republicans or lean Republicans have an even direr view. 77% think that universities are headed in the wrong direction, up from 66% 5 years ago. That same Pew poll also showed that nearly half of Americans also rate universities negatively on developing students' critical thinking and problem-solving skills, exposing students to a wide range of opinions and viewpoints, or providing students opportunities to express their opinions and viewpoints. A Gallup poll from last summer saw similar results, even as it detected a slight fillip in support over the last year. In 2015, 57% of Americans had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in higher education. Now only 42% do. Yes, there are differing ideological responses to university, especially over things like viewpoint diversity or Israel, but the broad picture showing up in survey after survey is that universities are held in increasingly less regard by the public. Politicians are people whose job it is to take seriously what the public thinks. And they recognize the majorities of those they represent think something is amiss in higher education. That's a particular problem because politicians also direct significant sums of public money to institutions of higher education. The scale and scope of this is often missed by university faculty, so I want just for a second to pause to stop and detail it in two examples that I know best, UF and UT Austin. So in its last budget, the state of Florida allocated $3.9 billion directly to the state university system. Those are the four-year colleges and universities. Another $1.8 billion to its community college system. Another $161 million to the state's HBCUs. $637 million to Bright Future scholarships, and another $675 million to performance funding. That's nearly $7.2 billion directed specifically toward higher education in the state of Florida, and that doesn't even capture money that's allocated for capital improvements. Out of this, the University of Florida gets eye-watering support from the state. From general revenue, UF got $715 million, while its health center got another $136 million, and IFAS, its agricultural outreach program, got another $193 million. From Bright Futures, the scholarship fund, it got another $137 million. So not including money also allocated to UF for capital improvements. That's about $1.2 billion investment in its flagship university of the state. And from federal grants, UF got another $659 million, pushing annual state and federal support for the university close to $2 billion. 1,000 miles down the road in Austin, UT Austin is also generously supported by state and federal funds. In its last biennial budget, UT received $336 million in direct support from the State General Revenue Fund, and another $403 million from the Available University Fund. That's the oil in West Texas. So that's nearly $750 million of direct state support. Around the same amount comes from federal, state, and local research grants. So all told, public funding accounts for nearly 45% of UT's $3.366 billion annual budget. And there's yet another piece of government support for these universities, student loans. For UF and UT and for all universities, federally supported loans help students cover tuition costs. So at UT, for instance, tuition and fees account for nearly 20% of total revenue. Well, right at 40% of students get federal loans, and another 1/4 receive Pell Grants. So what all this means is that the talk of public universities' independence is meaningless. If we want true independence, we can go the Hillsdale College route and not take a dime of federal or state money. We'd also be a radically different enterprise. Otherwise, we at American universities, especially public ones, need to recognize that we're public trusts supported by public funds. So it shouldn't surprise us that the people funding us expect us to do things. And it should be particularly worrying that both politicians and the public look at higher education with an increasingly jaundiced eye. I have to say, there's not seemed to be much indication that faculty are willing to take the necessary steps to win back the public's trust. Like many of you, I get the daily morning emails from the Chronicle of Education and Inside Higher Education. And the explanation one reads in these trade journals, and here's from colleagues about why higher education reform is being posed, broadly fall into one of two categories. One I'll call the madmen thesis, the other I'll call the bad men thesis. So the madmen thesis is that higher education is a marketing problem. People just don't all know all the great things we do. We need to message better. So presumably the people who messaged poorly for the last half century now will learn how to message better. The bad men thesis is a version of this. It's that there's actually nothing really wrong with universities, and that higher education reform is just bad people doing bad things to good people, good institutions. So Lee Bollinger, Michigan and Columbia's former president, for instance, contends that we live in a new age of authoritarianism. As he puts it, the pretense of abiding by the rules and norms of democracy and of basic rights and liberties is part of this version of authoritarianism. For authoritarianism, for the new authoritarians, everything you do is presented in terms of democratic ideals, protecting free speech, ending discrimination, insisting on diversity of thought, and cleansing the society of traitors. University, on Bollinger's analysis, are part of the good-hearted opposition to modern-day authoritarians. The virtue of these stories is they require no substantive change from universities other than to be more themselves. Call it the more cowbell strategy. The problem with these stories is that if acted upon, they open up universities to more and more pain in the future. And they open up universities to pain because neither the public nor the elected representatives see things the way that university faculty administrators do. Take, for example, the perceived ideological valence of universities. Now, even to mention the studies that detail just how far universities in general, in the humanities and social sciences in particular, skew far to the left of American society, raises faculty hackles. My politics never affect what I teach. I'm routinely assured by faculty who, at the same time, are absolutely certain that the politics of conservative faculty deform or even poison what they teach. One's personal political ideology on this view does not shape one's teaching at universities, except among conservative faculty. Unsurprisingly, then, we see the Berkeley historian David Hollinger recently decrying the false flag of viewpoint diversity, or the Stanford historian Priya Sadia fretting that viewpoint diversity might once again open the university's doors to eugenicists, Holocaust deniers, climate change deniers, election deniers, flat earthers, and the like. As she pungently puts it, the Republican Party today is the party of intellectually invalid viewpoints. Is there any wonder there are fewer Republicans among faculty? So not everyone is convinced of arguments like Sadia's. Chris Scilenza, John Hopkins' Dean of Arts and Sciences, and himself a very fine intellectual historian, reckons that those promoting higher education reform have a point regarding ideological skew. So he thinks the problems are particularly acute in parts of the humanities and social science, which, in his words, certain interpretive frameworks now dominate so thoroughly that they function as defaults rather than as hypotheses open to conversation. While acknowledging that narratives emphasizing injustice, exclusion, structural power do important work, Scilenza nevertheless worries that when they become sole or the expected analytical lenses, other questions get crowded out. Accounts that foreground institutional continuity, civic pluralism, religious traditions, military strength leading to peace, or the internal moral sources of inherited practices can be treated as apologetic or politically suspect before they're evaluated on scholarly grounds. Scilenza also sees similar dynamics in the social sciences, where belief in the value of free markets and the ability of capitalism to help people achieve social mobility, respect for religiously informed moral reasoning, or thick accounts of tradition and authority are sometimes treated less as serious normative positions than as phenomena to be explained or symptoms of false consciousness. He also worries about what he calls asymmetry, that is, that Western societies are often scrutinized with exceptional severity, while non-Western societies are approached with greater interpretive hesitation. Scilenza is one of a number of higher education leaders who've advocated the need for higher education reform, higher education to reform itself. The presidents at Dartmouth, Vanderbilt, WashU, Harvard, even Yale recently, are particularly notable voices and have attracted widespread criticism as a result. They work at private universities. For the moment at least, it seems to me, perhaps the more consequential work in building new things in higher education is happening at public universities. So the chief institutions being built at public universities are centers for civic education, like U.S. Hamilton School or UT Civitas Institute. Generically, these centers aim to think about the American political tradition in ways in its wider intellectual context and to model civil discourse in its curriculum. So many in the academy see these civic centers as Trojan horses, what are often called right-wing plots, to infiltrate the academy with conservative faculty. Having helped to build one successful civic center and having moved to start another one, suffices to say I have a slightly different perspective. The first thing I note is there is an enormous variety in these centers. All have legislative mandates which differ and have different and they have different institutional environments. So Hamilton's legislative mandate, for instance, is to educate universities in core texts and great debates in Western civilization and great books, to educate Americans, students in the principles, ideals, and institutions of the American political order, and to educate students in the foundations of responsible leadership and informed citizenry. This charge actually differs from the charges of legislative mandates for centers in Texas and North Carolina and Ohio. So too do the institutional environments at UF differ from those of other flagship universities. So before Hamilton, UF did not have an interdisciplinary major in liberal arts akin to those at UVA or Notre Dame, Harvard, Yale, and other top-flight AAU universities. Nor did it have a degree in PPE, unlike Michigan, Penn, and other AAUs. Nor did it have a degree in national security, nor did it have a degree in American studies. Now all of these are taught thanks to the Hamilton School. That relative open curricular field that we found at UF, though, is not always there at other flagship universities, which means functionally that the centers at flagship universities will have different educational focuses and mission. The second thing I'd note is that civic centers, contrary to perception, have no blueprints for them. I remember in December of 22, I walked into the loan administrator and said, do we have a website? Nope. Do we have offices? Nope. Do we have courses we can teach? Nope. Do we have curricula? Nope. Is there any blueprint? Nope. Who's supposed to figure it out? Have at it, right? That was the thing. So this is replicated every other place that I know about. So the legislature just writes these laws. Universities have to implement it. And what it means is that these will reflect the priorities of directors. So at UF and again at UT, the very clear, what directives the hiring priorities, right? The hiring criteria. Do you have the research record for an AAU university? If yes, move to the next stage. Do you want to teach in a multidisciplinary humanities unit focused on great books and core texts in American and Western history? If yes, check. Are you a culture builder or killer? That's an exclusion thing. That's a filter, and what you're left with are excellent people like Andrew's former student, Charlie Laterman, who was my colleague at UF and now will be my colleague again at UT. The fourth, and in the interest of time, final thing I'd say about these civic centers is that they're not actually all focused on civics. And often missed is that there's a robust debate among those in favor of higher education reform as to whether civic centers should actually be civics focused. So Will Inboden, my sometime and now current boss, who was the director at UF Hamilton School and now serves as UT Austin's provost, has most notably questioned the utility of civic thought as an organizing principle. It is, he notes, a notional academic field which is rather narrow and largely appeals to political theorists and related scholars. True. Even more importantly, it has none of the defined research methods of an academic discipline. Nor does he think that civic thought would be appealing major for undergrads. Also true. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, rightly, I think, he's concerned that funding new academic centers in civic thought makes them siloed off from the rest of the university, sort of alternate universes. Instead, he advocates that these centers should focus on research and teach on Western civilization more broadly and how the West has interacted with other civilizations and culture, such as Asia and the Islamic world. It's that vision that has animated Hamilton's growth and which animates the ongoing revision of the core curriculum at UT Austin now. So my sense is that the next phase of higher ed reform will be core curriculum reform at public universities. So at the moment, UT Austin's, like most, is just a set of distribution requirements, like going to the Ponderosa or the Golden Corral. It's just this vast array of food that you can pick from. There's nothing about the current core that provides foundational knowledge. So that, I think, will change. And so while our recommendations have not been released and won't be for another month, the committee is guided by principles that the core should be about knowledge, not about skills, and that core courses should be broad courses on big questions on fundamental themes. So while the core curricula at Chicago and Columbia have been inspirations for our work, we work at public universities, which brings in nearly 10,000 undergraduates a year annually. So it's going to have to reflect that particular reality. What I can say without question is that when adopted at UT, there's going to have to be a massive investment in hiring new faculty, both in traditional departments and in these centers, to be able to offer the core along the way that we would like to. If other universities follow this, which is the hope and seems to actually to be some indication it might, this will help bring more money and resources into humanities like they haven't been, I think, probably since the GI Bill did this. So finally, I'll lay my cards on the table, tell you what I tell students. I think there are four great institutions of Western Civs, all of which I think do a version of the same thing. And they are the church, the university, representative government, and pubs. Universities have been around for a long time. They've changed over time. They've always been places aimed at pursuing the truth. And that's something I think we all here could agree with. But they've also always served public goods and have relied on the public's support, whether through direct public subsidies or through private donations. And my sense is that we in higher education have largely forgotten that to our peril. And the reform efforts being foisted upon us are the result of that forgetting. Thank you.
All right, let's move to our fourth and final. Let us move to our fourth and final panelist, Michael Kleinman, who is the head of the U.S. Policy for the Future of Life Institute, one of the country's leading think tanks focused on AI-related issues. His career has ranged from serving as an aid worker in places such as Afghanistan, Iraq, and Sudan, to the AI policy team at Meta. He is a graduate of Yale University and Harvard Law School, and his writings have appeared, among other places, in The Washington Post, The Guardian, and Time Magazine. Today, he will be speaking on the current state of AI and its effects on U.S. politics. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Kleinman.
Thank you all so much for having me. A huge thank you to Alec, assuming he can actually get this to work. A huge thank you to Shallon for absolutely everything. And there's an interesting arc to this panel, which is we've talked and we've heard about sort of the history of US empire, at least in the 1930s and the 1940s. We've heard about aspects of contemporary US power, whether that's our nuclear posture or the quadrennium of pubs, universities, representative government, and the church. And I'm here to try and do something slightly more fraught, which is to talk about what I think is coming and the future. And so I would ask your forbearance to see this presentation as really a gambit, an attempt to extrapolate some of what we're seeing in terms of America in the age of AI and understand where we are going. And the reason that I ask your forbearance is that, as Niels Bohr said, prediction is difficult, especially about the future. And if nothing else, what I am trying to discuss and explain and myself understand today is, where are we going? Now, in terms of AI, if you take nothing else away from this presentation, I would love you to remember two stylized facts. First, leading tech companies are releasing AI models at an increasing pace. We see new models coming out every month, sometimes every week. And second, these new models are increasingly capable. So this is just the last, what's today, the 16th, these are the last 10 days. We have 3 significant new model releases from 2 of the leading AI companies in the country. What does this mean? This means that models are getting better, and they're getting better faster, and everything flows from this. The challenge is that this rate of change and that this rate of improvement is only increasing. Now, what that means, as well, is that talking about AI is really trying to hit a moving target. And some say, well, this rate of change is going to flatten out. And that could certainly happen, but we haven't seen any evidence of that yet. And what we're seeing instead is this rate of change and rate of improvement is only increasing. So how do we understand this? Because these models are incredibly complex. We often interact with them in very idiosyncratic ways. Math is an interesting way to understand just how quickly the capabilities of these models are growing. So way back in the ancient days of September of 2024, we all laughed that models like GPT-4 couldn't tell us how many R's there were in the word strawberry. Then by July 2025, models were making or achieving a gold medal in the International Math Olympiad. And then by January of this year, we have models that are starting to prove previously unsolved mathematical proofs, in this case, an Erdos problem. So over 14 months, we have gone from models that couldn't count 3 R's to models that are doing cutting-edge mathematical work. Now, this is not only the case when it comes to math. So we sort of the broader tech-related sector, develop evaluations and benchmarks to try and understand just how capable these models are. One of these is GPQA Diamond, which was developed by NYU. This is 198 multiple choice questions in biochem and physics that are designed to test PhD level knowledge. Now, when this test was given to PhDs, they scored 70% in their specialty or in their area of expertise. The most recent models, 94.5%. We also have a benchmark called the Multilingual Massive Multitask Language Understanding Model, or benchmark, which tests knowledge and understanding across 57 academic disciplines in 14 languages. Again, the most recent models score well over 90% on these kinds of tests, which no single human being would be able to master that breadth and depth of information. At the same time, it's not just that these models are getting better answering our questions, they're also starting to take actions in the real world. And so you might have heard there are initiatives like OpenClaw. What this is, it's an autonomous AI agent that can basically act as your own personal assistant. I would highly recommend that you do not do this. It is a security nightmare. It is a complete Wild West. But the fact is, it's not just that we type something into a chatbot and it spits back out an answer that is increasingly complex and increasingly correct, but these models are now able to do things, book things, look things up, and then take actions on what they find. Now, what is driving this dramatic increase in the capability of models? Part of this is compute, so data centers. The Magnificent Seven, Amazon, Apple, Alphabet, Meta, Microsoft, NVIDIA, and Tesla, this year are spending $650 billion on CapEx. Now, when we heard about the scale of investment in UT and UF, those were mind-boggling figures that were roughly 2% of the spending that we're seeing just this year. And this massive surge in CapEx spending represents a not insignificant percentage of US overall GDP growth. So in Q4 of 2025, this CapEx spending accounted for over 60% of GDP growth. Now, I was asked last night, and it's a question that I often get, is this all hype? Like, are the companies saying, look at these models, look how incredible they are, because they need investment to fund this massive build out? And the answer is yes. At the same time, makes me think of this statement, are you paranoid if they're really after you? Because what we're seeing here is it's hype, but it's justified hype. And this massive investment is producing real dividends in terms of models that are growing increasingly more powerful, and for the companies that are building them, opening up radically new opportunities to monetize these models. Now, oftentimes what people will say is that, like, listen, I typed something and this model still made a stupid mistake. It still hallucinates. Very true. We call this jagged intelligence. You can have a model that is world-class in something, and yet at the most basic task has less understanding than a child. Now, these hallucinations and basic mistakes are decreasing over time, but it still exists. But two things can be true at the same time. You can have jagged intelligence, really good on one thing, not as good on something else, and you can also have exponential progress. And to me, this is the most important chart illustration that I have seen in the last 3 or 4 months. And this is what an exponential looks like. This measures the time that a model can, or this measures here, let me get this straight. This is the time horizon chart, and it measures the maximum difficulty software engineering that models can complete over a given time period. And so here, the length of time that models can spend solving a problem is a really good proxy for the complexity of the problems that these models can solve. And what you'll see is over the last 3 months, models have gone from basically 3 hours to being able to solve problems that would require a human being about 14 or 15 hours worth of work. How do we measure, or how do we start to measure, the potential economic impact of models that are growing increasingly capable? OpenAI has developed something called GDP evaluation, which evaluates AI on real-world economically valuable tasks. So let's see, this covers 44 occupations featuring 1,320 specialized tasks constructed from actual work products. So based on things that actual accountants, actual lawyers, actual actuaries do. And then the evaluation compares the output of this model to the output of a professional in that field. And for the most recent model, what we're finding is that the model wins or ties human professionals, and this is today, 83% of the time. Now, it's a truism and a cliche, but also true, that the models today are as bad as they are ever going to be. So how quickly this will improve? Unclear. Will this number grow higher? Almost certainly. So what does that mean in terms of our society? What does that mean in terms of the impact that this is going to have on all of us here in this room? Certainly there are some positive economic impacts of AI. No one can deny that. You see increased productivity and you see incredible new economic opportunities. So this is, I think, 3 weeks ago, we have the first one-person, 1 billion company. This guy started a company using lots of AI, and within the course of a year was generating $1 billion worth of revenue. That is mind-blowing. Now, there is the other side of that coin, however. What we are also seeing, and what we will continue to see, are not just sort of AI-related layoffs, but also a growing threat of large-scale job displacement. Let's see here. Last year, 100,000 employees were impacted by AI-driven job layoffs. We have 61,000 people who've been impacted so far this year. And then I think of particular relevance when giving a talk at a university, it's not just layoffs and job loss across the economy as a whole, where we're really starting to see the economic impact of AI is on entry-level jobs. So a Stanford study from earlier this year found that there has been a 35% drop in entry-level jobs for people aged 22 to 25. And the reason for that, part of it's macroeconomics, most of it is that entry-level jobs are the easiest jobs to automate. And so it's not just that the impact of AI is going to show up in layoffs, it's also going to show up in things that are harder to measure, like jobs that are never posted or created or opened up in the first place. So what is the impact this is having on youth and young adults? There was a recent report, a survey by the Walton Family Foundation, and it found that Gen Z is using AI a lot, but the more they use it, the more anxious they are about its impact. So over the last year, the percentage of Gen Z respondents who were excited about AI has fallen from 36 to 22%. The percentage who are angry about the impact that AI is having has risen from 22 to 31%. We are also seeing an increase in AI-induced psychosis and suicidal ideation. This is incredibly fraught. This is the Adam Rain case. He was a teenager who used ChatGPT, and it actively encouraged him to commit suicide. It told him how to tie a noose. It told him not to tell his parents. OpenAI recently settled this case. This, unfortunately, is not an isolated incident. And I think what is not just incredibly heartbreaking, but also in some ways, and I use this word, and I wish I had a better one, fascinating about cases like this, is it shows that we don't really understand what we're building. Say what you will about any of these companies, and I will say very negative things about these companies. None of them set out to build a model that would encourage a child to commit suicide. This is no one's interest. And they all spend resources and time to try and ensure that their models don't do that. And yet the models still do. And this is mind-blowing. right? We don't open Microsoft Word and all of a sudden Microsoft Word is telling you to commit suicide, right? Like that is a category error. And we wouldn't buy a product if you opened Microsoft Word or Excel and all of a sudden it began telling you things that the company didn't want it to tell you. But that's exactly what happens with AI because these models are so powerful, because we don't fully understand how they work. We can't even put guardrails in place on the most basic things like we don't want a model to tell a child how to tie a noose. Now, these models also increasingly have very significant national security implications. There was I'm sure you all heard, one of the leading AI companies, Anthropic, got into quite a tussle with the Department of War last month about the use of their models and restrictions that the company wanted to put on those models. And without getting into who was right or who was wrong in this particular conflict, what's significant is that over the course of a year and a half, these companies have gone from being consumer tech or enterprise tech to being basically defense contractors. The Department of War and the intelligence community increasingly relies on these models for fundamental targeting and intelligence intelligence synthesis, and to the point where it's hard to imagine a future conflict where the country that has the best models does not have a significant, if not incomparable, advantage. Which leads us all to the last 2 weeks and what I call the mythos moment. Last week, Anthropic, which is one of the leading AI companies, announced that its new model posed such a significant cybersecurity risk that they would not release it to the public. And why did this model pose such a significant risk? Because it autonomously discovered thousands of vulnerabilities across almost every critical internet system that they pointed it to. And so if you release something like this, this means that not only state actors, but non-state actors would be able to hack into huge swaths of the internet. This is the moment that AI stopped being a theoretical risk and has emerged as an actual structural, systemic national security concern. How did the government react? The Fed chair and the Treasury Secretary called an emergency meeting of leading bank executives to talk about how they needed to harden their systems in response to this. And even President Trump himself, who is no fan of AI regulation, said that we need a kill switch on corporate AI systems so the government, if necessary, can shut them down. I work mostly on this. How is AI a political issue? Like, what we do is we try and educate lawmakers around the risks and opportunities of AI, and we push for common sense AI regulation. And what is fascinating is that AI is a political issue, but it is not a partisan issue. And internally, we refer to this as the Bernie to Bannon spectrum, where you have two human beings who have as little in common as Steve Bannon and Bernie Sanders, who say almost exactly the same things when it comes to AI. We think of Republicans as often being more resistant to regulation than Democrats, yet the people who are leading the push to regulate AI include Senators Hawley and Blackburn, and red state governors like Governor DeSantis and then Governor Cox in Utah. We also see that public opinion, and not just amongst Gen Z, is beginning to turn against AI. And what I mean by turn against AI is becoming increasingly concerned about the impacts that companies without any restrictions on their power developing and releasing these systems have. So an NBC poll from early March found that 26% of respondents had a favorable view versus 46% who had a negative view. And this is not simply a a blue state phenomenon. So the Conservative Institute for Family Studies surveyed voters in, give me a moment here, Florida, Kentucky, Louisiana, Michigan, Tennessee, Utah, and all of them said that they were more likely to support politicians who supported or who proposed more rather than less AI regulation. Part of what's driving this, as I mentioned earlier, are a growing concern around the impact that AI is going to have on jobs. And here there's a really interesting dichotomy between, for lack of a better term, normal people, those of us in this room who say that, or 64% of whom say that AI will cause or fewer jobs going forward, and then quote AI experts who say no, it won't be that bad. But yet even AI experts say, 40% of AI experts say that AI will cause fewer jobs going forward. Who is sounding the alarm? And I am almost done. But what I think is absolutely fascinating is this concern about AI is also a direct response to what the tech company CEOs themselves are saying. So here we have the CEO of Anthropic, again, one of the leading AI companies, saying that his systems will probably cause a white-collar bloodbath. This is like the CEO of Philip Morris 20 years ago saying, this shit will give you cancer. I mean, when is the last time that a CEO said, this product is going to have a massively negative impact on our society as a whole? Sorry, here my slides are out of order. Push for AI regulation is bipartisan. What is the right historical analogy? I personally think almost all historical analogies are deeply flawed. Some people say this is like the printing press. They say it's like the Industrial Revolution. They say it's like the internet. What I think of when people say this is the printing press, 1440s, Gutenberg, 1519, Martin Luther, theses to the wall. That was 80 years for the printing press to really have an impact on what was happening in Europe. The first Industrial Revolution, was it the 1760s to the 1830s. That was a 70-year process. The second Industrial Revolution, 1870 to 1914. That was a 45-year process. The internet itself, we've been living with the internet for 30 years. We are still trying to understand its impact. And why I think these analogies aren't particularly relevant when it comes to AI is the speed with which it is beginning to impact our society. Everything in this slide, everything in this presentation has happened over the last 3 years. And almost all the articles that I put up here and all the surveys are from the last few weeks. And the speed with which this is changing is only increasing. And so I think the fundamental question we face is how to ensure that this technology benefits and does not disempower us. Thank you, guys.
Okay, well, we have about 30 minutes left for questions. Who would like to start? Okay, how about Meg?
I actually have a question for Michael Kleinman. AI is a fascinating subject. It's affecting pretty much every aspect of life. You talk about the security risks centered on AI and the United States government and populace wanting more regulations to try to curb its more excessive tendencies. However, the United States is only one nation.
How does what?
The United States is only one nation.
Right.
What's to stop China, for example, of creating their own models and using this to run rampant in other nations' electronic infrastructure?
Yeah. So there are three answers to that question.
Okay.
Answer number one, China is actually putting in place regulations themselves. They see this risk. And so in terms of tracking compute, in terms of limiting how their companies are using it, they are doing exactly what people like Governor DeSantis are suggesting. Second, the rate with which China is able to capitalize, leverage, and deploy AI is completely dependent on the United States. And it's completely dependent on the United States because we control the flow of chips that data centers are built on. And so if you're concerned about China overtaking the United States, then the number one thing that you should be focused on, and there's a fight between Congress and the administration over this, is restricting chip exports to China, which is popular as a bipartisan issue and for various reasons, some of which are very defensible. The Trump administration is reluctant. But the ability of China to overtake the United States is something that, one of the few things when it comes to geopolitics, over which we do have a fair amount of leverage. And then third, there's also a bit of a category error here. Because we are not saying, both as FLI or sort of, I think, people like people like Senator Hawley or Senator Blackburn, that we shouldn't continue to develop models that are powerful, right? What we're saying is letting companies develop these models without any regulation is a tremendous risk. Every other industry that develops products which have tremendous utility but also risk is regulated. Pharma is a great example, right? We don't get on an airplane unless that airplane's been inspected by the FAA. And yet the companies that are developing these models face less regulation than a sandwich shop. And that's the fundamental issue.
Thank you.
Yes.
I suppose in my case, my question is a little bit twofold. First off, I know you said analogies work fairly poorly, but my first part of this is a lot of the AI science has not yet found a way to prove itself profitable, which is going to be necessary to truly sustain it going forward. So is there a risk of that when the bills eventually do come due, that being a significant slowdown? And in the same token, for the second question I have, you mentioned it's destroying entry-level jobs, and that's kind of one of the necessary building blocks because AI doesn't, to my understanding, do a great job at creating so much as using what already exists to an extent. So is there also a little bit of risk of it starting to cannibalize itself if it becomes a bit too powerful from that?
So, they're great questions. Why are investors supporting companies to put, it's often out of free cash flow, $650 billion into this? And it's not because they think that those of us in this room paying $20 or $200 a month or whatever we're paying for a subscription is going to net out. And enterprise sales are very powerful. So Anthropic is looking at $30 billion a year in revenue. That's great. But that is also not enough to justify the amount of money going into it. Where the money is when these models really start to automate large swaths of knowledge work. Because then the companies that control those models stand to make an ungodly amount of money. And so you can draw a connection between investment, model capabilities, and job displacement, and the underlying economic model or revenue model which is driving these companies. That's the golden goose. Now, you kill the golden goose, what impact does automating huge swaths of our economy and skyrocketing unemployment have? That's a risk that they are more than willing to externalize. So your second question, and this gets to sort of rapidly increasing model capabilities, we are getting to, if we have not already reached the point where models are able to do, and all of this is in some ways an analogy. None of the language is particularly precise, are able to do cutting edge work on their own, where they're able to generate their own work product and then build from that. So what we're starting to see, and this is when people talk about recursive self-improvement, is a flywheel where the models are able to improve themselves.
Okay, back there.
I'd like a two-part for Balzer. So my first question is like, do you think that like removing the land-based like Tomahawk missiles from East Asia during the Obama administration kind of like significantly hampered the like pivot to Asia? And then the second would be because that we and China are both pursuing AI in turn. Well, there's an arms race within arms race with AI and nuclear weapons, and the integration of the two. But do you think that could possibly be an inroads for diplomacy with Chinese, and I guess getting back to stability with non-proliferation treaties or the limitations of nuclear arms that's kind of been eroded by the Russians?
So good questions. On the first one, on the TLAM and retiring it from the force. At the time of its removal, one could arguably say it made perfect sense, right? Because at that time, in 2013, China still had a very small-scale, limited nuclear arsenal. It was a lesser-included case. At that time, I think, as I mentioned, we could have conducted a fairly substantial first strike that really wipes out its entire retaliatory capability. So retiring the TLAM kind of made sense. One could make a credible argument for retiring it. But again, this is why we hedge. And so a wiser decision would have been to just keep it in the force in storage so we can rapidly bring it back in. That may have been a route. And on the second question, with the integration of AI and nuclear forces and strategic stability with China. So China refuses to talk to us on any issues dealing with their nuclear weapons capability. So that obviously makes it very difficult for us to open conversations with them on the integration between AI and our nuclear forces. But really, the relations between the two, the biggest impact I think AI will have in the immediate future will be on improving our ability to target and retarget our forces, and it will work the same way for China. But yeah, the first step with China would be to get them to just discuss nuclear issues with us, and then we can work towards broader conversations on AI.
Professor Hill.
Oh, thank you. So I have a question for Dr. Ingram. I have many professors around me. But it's also a question actually which has China in the background, like many of these other questions, right? When we think about the state of American power today, I think implicitly there's always this comparison with the state of Chinese power. And one of the big aspects of American power over the last few decades, of course, has been our university system and its place in the global order. And so with that as a background, my question is, first, how do you see civic centers as interacting with this issue of U.S. soft power through universities? Are these a potential place for international students to go? And if so, how do you deal in particular with the non-Western students who may find themselves at centers for the study of Western civilization? And the second part of this would be just more broadly with the issues of university reform inside the United States. There have been substantial funding interruptions to the other ways in which universities have contributed to American national power, science and technology research, et cetera. And so how do you see that playing into what's emerging as a global competition between American universities and PRC universities?
Yeah. So, yeah, I'll take, it may not be satisfactory answers. So an unexpected, like this H-1B thing has been a real challenge. So Hamilton, our hiring through the case, we hired 48 tenured and tenure track faculty in 2.5 years. 12 of those were on H-1B or visas, like Charlie Lederman was one of them. Our basic theory of the case was there are a ton of really bright and productive Oxbridge, LSE, London PhDs who, because of the shrinking of the American PhD programs in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, it was like shrunk to 6 where for MA and PhD. Functionally, the British PhD would be about like that. You'd have a master's plus 3 years of research. And so we thought that the kind of long-standing kind of bias against having UK PhDs would be that. So we sort of leaned into that, and now it's $100,000 per H-1B visa that you have to pay for, and the states of Florida and Texas have a temporary ban locally until 2027 on new H-1B visas. So if one way of soft power is actually hiring people and to come in and that's been public policy has made that harder. I think that's fair to say. Look, I mean, you have to deal with non-Western. Non-Western students have to deal with Western culture all the time, right? There's a required American history course in the state of Texas. The state imposes on it. The core curriculum will likely have a kind of Western Civ course that will play. It has 2 Americans, so it'll likely have a Western Civ course on that. I mean, that's like everybody has to take that. It's not seen as the only thing that you have to take, but it is an option. And these centers are, they're like psych or physics or WUGAS or history, or they're optional, right? You can take it or not. What I can say is from like on the ground that in January of 2023, Hamilton had 0 students. By this academic year, they'll teach 3,000 students, so 0 to 3,000 in that. And in an apples-to-apples comparison, there's a course in the general education of something like our Tier 3 here, but it's for freshmen. So it's something that can only be taught by faculty. So it's no grad students, no TAs or anything like that. The teaching evaluations were 12 to 15% higher for the faculty in Hamilton than for the university as a whole. So I think my argument would be, what do you get from these? Better teaching, and the research standards were, I think the administration at UF would say. The complaints we were getting was that it was skewing the standards in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and making it, the provost office expecting a higher bar. Like some of the people we were having who'd come out of like a Cambridge JRF were just, they just hammered out a bunch of articles. So we had somebody come up with, for tenure, with a book and 15 articles, and half of them were in Q1 journal. So they in the history department, we're like, no, we don't want that. So I don't have fun. The funding interruptions. Look, I'm not here to defend every single thing, right? Some of these higher reform things I look at and go, this is not always optimal, and the funding. So, I mean, I don't know. Does 69%? I mean, what is it, Harvard? I mean, your alma mater, like 69% overhead. That seems a lot. 15% maybe too low. These are also, but the hits on these scientific funding is really problematic because it funds things like the library, the history department. Most humanities departments don't pay for themselves through which you can't. Not every humanities department can eat what it kills, and so these things have a real problem. And what I'd go back to the point is, one of the long-standing things is universities. I mean, just for my sins, I had to sit through the faculty senate meetings, every faculty senate meeting at UF, and it was not. I mean, it's like an embarrassment, right? It's like the way that faculty talk about it. It wasn't an adult for to have a discussion about public policy in relation to the state. So I just think if faculty just sort of said, like, geez, we exist because of public support, that's at least a start, And I think a lot of this stuff, including really negative, really in some ways ham-handed and I think misguided reforms, happen just because we think, we will say, we need to be left alone. Our independence is being attacked. Well, we're not independent. So just scratch that and then have a new basis of having a conversation with public authorities. And I think that makes it better. And some of the really negative things, like the kind of effects of the scientific cuts. But also maybe don't ask for 69% overhead. So like I'll give you an example. Put in a grant for an NEH grant for $10 million, right? 54% of that was supposed to be for overhead. For an NEH grant? We were like, mass spectrometer was going to be running during that time. No, but I mean, this is just the university, and there was, and you have these sort of internal fights at universities too. I mean, just like you have here, the foundation can run something, or the Office of Sponsored Research can run something. OSP wants it because they get it. You have this like weird internal university power dynamics going on. So I think if we can get away from universities trying to charge 54% overhead for a NEH grant or an NEA grant, I think that might go some way to convincing, people who shovel the money toward us that we're better stewards of it. It's my guess.
Could I just add a personal note onto the H-1B discussion or point that Robert just mentioned? So you mentioned my student, Charlie Lederman, who moved from King's College London to UF and came over on an H-1B. And I did the same at the same time Charlie did. So August just last year, I moved from the UK to UVA and came over on an H-1B. And that was 2 months before this $100,000 fee was introduced. And so if I was off by 2 or 3 months, I wouldn't have been able to come. I'm from Canada. I'm not from the US. And so I had to come in on a visa. There were other possible routes for me as a Canadian that might get shut off in the future because of this inexplicable downturn in Can-Am relations, but I had maybe other options, but other people didn't. And I know that because another, I won't say his name, but a different PhD student of mine from Cambridge who just graduated got an incredible offer from an Ivy League university for a postdoc that was extremely well funded and was for 4 years, and it was like an absolute dream position. And he had to turn it down because the university would have wanted to use or needed to use an H-1B to bring him in because he's not from Western Europe or from Canada. He's from a country that has more fraught visa relations with the United States, and he had to turn down this lifetime dream opportunity. Luckily, something did turn up in the UK where he already was. But I just think that the US is in some ways, sort of shutting the doors to people who want to come to the US. And it is, as you said, a form of soft power. I've been teaching in China for several years, and over that time, last time I was there was 2025, summer of 2025. And over that time, I've noticed that Chinese students went from, they would do anything to get into a US university, into an MA program or a PhD program. Some of them were high school seniors, and they all desperately wanted to come to the United States for college. And then over time, especially in the last year, that's just almost dropped off. And they're now going to Chinese universities instead. So I think there's an opportunity cost there.
Yeah, so, sorry, these like the visa stuff, like a soft power example. I was trying to think of an actual example. So I went last year to at Cambridge. Is this like the history faculty has a Skinner lecture, right? It's just sort of this annual prize. One of our first hires, Max Gunsberg, won it. It's like tremendous scholar. So I went to it, and the man after whom the lecture was, Quentin Skinner, came up to me. I'd never met Skinner. Came up to me and said, "Are you the man hiring our graduates?" And that was and so a lot of the talk then was, "Geez, tell me more about UF. This is good." Da da da. And you talk and so it's a little thing, right? It's a tiny thing, but the visa stuff I wish it weren't thus. It is. That's what it is. But I think there are unintended consequences, as Andrew pointed to, for really outstanding people to be able to come on the basis of merit, to be able to come to do it.
Professor Milazzo.
I run for Professor Preston. So I signed your book to my graduate students. I hope they're here. I had a couple of questions about the book. One's more inside baseball. So you mentioned in it that Mel Loeffler, your esteemed predecessor at UVA, had a similar way of defining national security, right? The idea of not allowing, potentially hostile states to accumulate preponderant power, to prevent them from monopolizing resources, creating a garrison state, right? And yet Mel, when push came to shove, didn't think that domestic politics really influenced national security. So one, I was wondering where you came out on that question. And second, and sort of more contemporarily, Do you think Donald Trump will be remembered as the most consequential neoconservative?
Wow. Yeah, that second one I'm gonna have to think about. That's a really good way of putting it. I mean, Steve Bannon would be having, a seizure if and that sort of branch of the movement of the America First movement of MAGA would be having a seizure if they thought of it, that he would go down in history like that. But stranger things have happened or are happening. On the first point about domestic politics, first question, that's really good, and that gets to the heart of my research on national security. So, I owe a lot to Mel Leffler in terms of how he defines national security. He was probably the most important diplomatic historian to do that kind of historical work. If he doesn't actually say this, but if he says national security has a history, its origin moment would be in the early Cold War. And I predate that by a decade, and you might think, well, what does a decade matter? I think it matters a lot because if you sort of root this expansive, capacious notion of self-defense to the early Cold War, it's about sort of reacting to communism. It's about maybe paranoid anti-communism or German anti-communism that isn't paranoid, but it's about communism. It's reactionary. It has a conservative sort of strain to it. And I think by sort of backdating it by a decade and situating it within the New Deal and seeing national security and social security as two sides of the same coin, and seeing that national security has more sort of liberal origins to it in this new social contract that I talked about in my talk, it helps explain, I think, the actual history of how national security and the national security state grew, at least during the Cold War. It helps us think about, answer sort of puzzles that historians have kind of looked at, but maybe not with the kind of attention that I give to them. But why was it that the war presidents of the 20th century were progressive liberal Democrats? Woodrow Wilson, FDR, Harry Truman, and Lyndon Johnson. And then the critics of the national security state were often on the right, people like Robert Taft or Herbert Hoover, as I talked about, and why it was someone like Eisenhower who coined the term military-industrial complex. It's not coming from the new left. And that it has a lot to do with the growth of the state. And that changes after Vietnam. It changes with Ronald Reagan, where conservatives make their peace with the national security state. Liberals become a bit more uncertain about it. But that origin moment from the 30s to the 60s, to me, really matters in setting up a lot. And a lot of that has to do with just domestic politics and how, not just in terms of domestic political sort of ideas about domestic political economy, but how you, for lack of a better term, sell those ideas to the voters. I think it was one of my co-panelists, but I think it's Robert, who said, you have to respond to the voters. You have to respond to what public opinion is, otherwise you're going to lose your job if you're an elected official. And so the ways in which national security were legitimated were partly about political economy, but partly just about sort of domestic political needs in terms of selling a policy to the people that made sense. And then it sticks with Pearl Harbor, and then it really sticks with World War II and the early Cold War.
Okay, well, I am going to exercise the monitor's privilege and ask the last question for Andrew Preston. When you were giving your talk, I kept thinking about the relationship, the technological leap that is happening at this time when FDR is creating this national security state. You have German U-boats that can travel long distances. You have the German Happy Time of 1942. You have a Japanese sub that actually, on a one-off thing, shells an American oil refinery on the West Coast. You have airplanes. You have Africa, where the Axis has an interest in being closer to the Americas and creating and because of increased air technology, becoming more of a threat. By the end of the Second World War, you have the travel for airtime for American officers from America to Britain goes from like 2 days to under 24 hours. By the 1960s, that has increased so much. Where you're talking, Eisenhower says in his military-industrial complex speech that the weapons we have today bear very little relation to those we used to fight World War II, and that's true. So how does technology impact this idea of national security?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a question that, as we saw in a way that really freaked me out from Michael's presentation, just about how AI is scrambling that. And maybe I was thinking during your presentation that what I was saying, this history of national security, the history itself stands, but maybe we're at an inflection point now that is, it's not even an inflection point, it's a moment of serious rupture that has nothing to do with Donald Trump. And maybe we won't be talking about Trump 50 or 100 years from now. We'll be, well, we may not be talking about anything, but it'll be more about these technological changes that transform our sense of threat. And that's, you know, in relative terms, I certainly take the point about how the Industrial Revolution and the printing press and the internet are, you know, probably will pale or are pale, you know, they do pale in comparison to what's happening now. But in relative terms, the changes in communications of that second industrial revolution, people felt it in a way that we feel now, and we might be able to measure that it's a greater impact now in all sorts of ways. And I'm not arguing that AI isn't categorically different, but at the time, people certainly felt that was a kind of epochal change in so many ways. And economic historians have looked at this in various ways from the late 19th to the early 20th century, just about how the changes were just, you know, in sort of, it increased efficiency or it increased travel times or whatever in exponential ways that you talk about. But the thing that when it comes to national security is, and I tried to hint at this very briefly in my talk, is that just how it cut both ways. It didn't always necessarily increase vulnerability. Charles Lindbergh said all sorts of, and represented all sorts of really reprehensible ideas, but he was an expert on air power. And when you read his congressional testimony and his radio speeches on how air power favors the defender when in almost any situation in the 1930s, 40s, but especially where, you know, given the United America's geographic position, it's pretty compelling. And so every time someone like Franklin Roosevelt would say, he would give a fireside chat, and he would tell Americans, I want you to sort of look at the world with me, but don't pull out an atlas. If you can, pull out a globe. Because a flat paper atlas doesn't really convey the sense of just how close we're living to the rest of the world. He said, look at the globe, and then he would sort of take points of distance from places in the US to places in Asia and Europe, and how you just go over the pole. And he would say, look how close the bulge of Africa is to Brazil and South America, and what's going on in South America, and that sort of thing. But every argument that someone like FDR would make about how technology has increased vulnerability, others could make an argument that actually technology increases defense. So then and there's this huge literature on how this kind of determinative look of technology, that the rise of air power therefore inevitably leads to these policies or this mindset. And I'm not sure that's true, and that's why domestic politics, sort of New Deal liberalism, ideology, political economy, those sorts of things then shape the debate in a way that then leads to the acceptance of what we might call the national security state.
Okay, well, thank you, and I'd like to thank, why don't you all join me in thanking our panelists?